I have mentioned in passing some of the various kinds of things that MaxScript can work with, such as numbers, text, string, scene objects, rollout definitions, and so on. I'd like to talk more rigorously now about the various types of values you can use and the way they're organized. All these computable things are generically known as objects or values, and they're organized into type-based groups called classes. So there are classes like number, string, time, sphere, omnilight, and so on. There are actually several hundred classes that MaxScript knows about, and more can be added through Max plugins. Every value you compute with belongs to one of these specific classes. Individual values in these classes are also known as instances of the class. You can find out what class a value is using the class of function, like this. And this is often useful when processing a set of Max scene objects, and you want to do something special depending upon the object's class. This loop, for example, would scan all the objects in the scene and print the radius of just the spheres. Here I'm looping the variable O over the scene objects in a standard collection-based for loop, and in the body comparing the class of each object to sphere and doing the print only if it's a sphere. Being in a particular class defines the set of operations and functions that are available for use with a value and the properties it has. For example, the plus operator can be used with numbers and strings, but not, say, materials or cameras, whereas the move function can be used with cameras and lights and geometry, but not numbers and strings. Spheres have radius and slice and hemisphere properties, among others, whereas the noise modifiers have scale and roughness and seed properties. Large parts of the MaxScript help file are organized by class, listing all the kinds of operators and functions and properties associated with each of them. It turns out that the classes themselves are organized into hierarchical groupings of similar classes. This helps in dealing with the hundreds of classes in MaxScript, and most importantly, enables the factoring of common operations and properties into these groups. For example, the classes integer and float contain the whole numbers and real numbers respectively. Recall that real numbers are known as floating point numbers on a computer, or floats for short. Anyway, integer and float are organized into a group called number. This group is also a class, a kind of class of classes. Since there are a lot of common operations and functions on integers and floats, we factor them up into the number class and so only have to define them once. We say that integer and float inherit these common things from number. And we also say that number is the superclass of the classes integer and float. Here's the topic in the help file for the number class, and as you can see, it lists the integer and float subclasses and all the operators here and functions here that you can use on numbers. Another big hierarchy of classes is the one that contains all the Max objects, like geometry, lights, cameras, effects, controllers, and so on. There is one overall superclass for all these classes known as Max Wrapper. Its immediate subclasses include material, controller, modifier, atmospheric, and so on. These classes are also superclasses themselves, and each has its own set of subclasses. For example, material subclasses include standard material, blend, multi-material, and so on. In other words, all the kinds of actual materials you can create in Max. This final level of classes are the ones you can actually construct in MaxScript. One particular subclass of Max Wrapper is called Node, and it contains another level of superclasses that contain all the classes you can place into the scene. Instances of all these classes are also known as scene nodes, since you can arrange them in linking hierarchies, which is why this superclass is called Node. So, Node subclasses include geometry class, camera, light, helper, spacewalk, and so on. These superclasses, in turn, contain the actual classes you can construct in the scene. So, camera has subclasses free camera and target camera, and geometry class has subclasses such as box, sphere, cylinder, spindle, etc. At each level in the hierarchy, common properties and operations are factored together and so are inherited by all the subclasses and all their subclasses, and so on. Here are all the common node operations like move, rotate, delete, and properties like name, position, wire color, and so on. And here, for example, are the specific operations and properties for cylinder. In order to know the total set of operations and properties you can use on a given class, you have to follow the superclass hierarchy upwards. Although the set of MaxWrapper superclasses is fixed for any particular release of Max, new constructible subclasses can be introduced anytime you add third-party plugins. For example, a new plugin material will typically add one or more new material subclasses. Although the MaxScript help file documents all of the classes shipped with Max, it obviously cannot contain any info on classes in third-party plugins you add later. In some cases, the plugin developer will provide MaxScript documentation and perhaps even other MaxScript extensions to help script the plugin, but often this is not the case. MaxScript, nevertheless, is usually able to let you create instances of the plugin and access its parameters as properties. There are a couple of utility functions that help you explore the MaxWrapper classes. The showClass function will search for MaxWrapper classes given a name pattern like this. As you can see, it lists the two MaxWrapper classes whose names start with sphere. Each class's superclass is shown after the colon. Sphere is a geometry subclass. Sphere Gizmo is a helper subclass. I can also ask for a list of the known properties on objects in the class, like this, the dot indicating properties. It lists the available property names and their types. So, if you installed some new plugins and want to check scriptability, you could use showClass to do this. For example, I've installed the electric texture plugin from Blur Studios, and in the material browser it shows up under that name. If I run this, you see the class name, its superclass, and its accessible properties. Notice I put stars at either end to match any class with the word electric in it. In some cases where plugins are not specifically set up for scripting, the names could be illegal global variable names. So MaxScript does some tweaking to the names that you should be aware of. For example, the Blur Fire Atmospheric plugin shows up with this name in the environment dialog with dots and spaces. If I run showClass on this, you see that MaxScript has turned all the invalid characters in the name to underscores, and this is the name you need to use when constructing a fire atmospheric in MaxScript. In recent versions of Max, schemes have been introduced that allow additional plugin and core Max functionality to be exposed to the scripter. The most powerful is the so-called interface mechanism. The Max programmer can bundle up a set of related functions or properties in an object called an interface and make it available to MaxScript. There were over 50 new interfaces added in Max R4, all documented in the Interfaces topic in the MaxScript help. As an example, you can now control the main menu bar and quad menus through the interface called MenuMan. Here's its help page, and you can see it has functions for loading and saving menus, and registering menus and quad menus, and so on. The functions in an interface are accessed as properties of the interface using the standard dot notation. So, to call the load menu file function, for example, you'd say this. Some interfaces are associated with specific object classes, and the functions and properties in them can be accessed as dot properties directly on an object itself. For example, two new methods for bitmap texture map objects were added in R4 via the bitmap text interface. One lets you force a file reload, and the other opens the texture file in a viewer window. These functions are accessed as properties on an individual texture map, like this, for example. Here, I navigated to the diffuse map in the sphere's material and called the reload function on it. Analogous to the showClass inspector function, there are functions for inspecting interfaces as well. Show interfaces can be called on an object to see what interfaces it has, like this. Or, if you know the name of an interface, you can display its functions with the show interface function, like this. I want to introduce now a couple of final terms related to classes as they're used throughout the MaxScript documentation. As we've seen, many of the operators and functions can be used on instances of more than one class, such as plus on numbers and strings and vectors, and move on all the scene node classes. Because they work on instances of multiple classes, they're known as generic functions, and you will see them referred to as such in the documentation. Each class that supports a particular generic function or operator provides an implementation of that generic that is specific to that class. These class-specific versions of the generic are known as methods, and so you will see methods for all the supported generics documented in the class reference sections. Note that because of inheritance from superclasses, definitions of methods for a particular class may often be up in the superclass section of the docs, so remember to look there as well to get a full sense of the capabilities of a class. For example, let's look at the help page for the geometry class box. You can see the properties for the box object corresponding to a box's creation parameters, but no methods. Now, on most class help pages, you'll see down the bottom here links to all the classes' superclasses in inheritance order. So, a box is a kind of geometry, and so inherits geometry class properties and operators and methods, which in turn inherits from node, which inherits from MaxWrapper, which inherits from the special class value, which is the root superclass of all classes in MaxScript. We can look at the page for each superclass to find all of the things it can do. Here are the common geometry operators, basically just methods for plus and minus that do Boolean geometry combination. And here is the node page with lots of scene node related stuff like transform methods, cloning methods, and so on, and so on. Up another superclass level to the MaxWrapper class, and we have stuff common to all Max objects. And finally up to the value level, where we see capabilities common to all values, like comparison, printing, and asking about a values class hierarchy. If you want to see a nested list of all the built-in classes known to MaxScript, check out the MaxScript class hierarchy topic in the help.